So really quickly, just want to talk about just some expectations, lay some of the groundwork of today. I'm very much aware that there are varying levels of people that are joining the calls, joining this call, varying levels of grantsmanship and research and things of that nature. So I'll try my best to cover enough so that everybody can leave away with something. But ultimately, the purpose of today's call is to talk through how we can strengthen capacity in these institutions and organizations so that we could better compete and manage research funding. And so a lot of the focus today is going to primarily be around grants and contracts, grants versus contracts, just kind of talking about the differences between the two and then, how they kind of coincide as well. And then ultimately, the goal is just to enhance practical understanding of those processes as we talk about receiving awards, process, proposal success, and awards management. So it's a lot to kind of go over, but it's kind of an overview of all of those things. So we'll just take it from there. All right. So a research grant ultimately, and this is just kind of a broad definition, just for us to kind of start by, but it's basically funding that supports a public purpose or some type of scholarly activity. So, the grants are ultimately given out to help some type of public purpose, right? They are investigator driven. So when I say investigator, that's usually, principal investigator, that's project director, project manager. Um, for those research grants, ultimately, the principal investigator is going to drive what the scope is going to be. And what I mean is, so when you're looking at some of those research grants, they already have defined the specific research area that they're looking to cover or fund, right? And so um, based on that research area, it's up to the principal investigator to kind of come up with the outline of what it is your research is gonna cover. So you have a lot of flexibility there. And then it moves right into the budget as well, right? You have a lot of flexibility on those line items because you're telling the funder, hey, this is what I want to research. This is what it would take for me to complete this research and have these measurable outcomes and things of that nature. And so some of those big players there, of course, it's going to be National Institutes of Health, NIH, NSF, National Science Foundation, Department of Education. They have some research grants. Department of Energy sometimes has some research contracts. I do want to point out though on NSF for those that don't know, and I'm pretty sure all of you on this call are very familiar, but they have a huge plethora of resources on their website, on National Science Foundation's website. They even have this proposal guide that specifically talks to each one of those specified areas of research grants and research funding that they offer. I would recommend that you definitely go around and just take some time to go through their site, look through some of those resources. They're very helpful for anyone that works in this effort. Okay. All right. So now, we're talking about contracts now, right? And again, this is kind of a broad overview of a research contract. So as opposed to, funding that's given for a public or scholarly endeavor or some type of public purpose, research contracts are a procurement mechanism, right? So it's very specific deliverables for the acquisition of services, right? For a specific purpose. And so with that being said, and as opposed to the research grants, those research contracts, they're going to be more sponsored or funder defined scope, right? It's much more specified. This is exactly what we want. These are the milestones that we're looking for. These are the deliverables, outcomes, and it's much more specified on what's required and what's expected. With that said, for a contract, there are some stricter performance and reporting terms, right? Some stricter performance measures. And I don't know. I mean, that may be subjective, depending on the funder. But just by and large, they're a little bit stricter than those grant funds. And then just lastly, they often do includes penalties and remedies within the contract, and you'll see them in the actual contract in that scope of work, it would talk about what those would be. These can include like withhold measures, like a certain amount of the contract won't be paid out unless certain deliverables are met. It could be liquidated damages if there are certain things that you are to complete or deliverables to be met, and if they're not met timely, then there could be some penalties that could happen in real time. So those are just, a couple of things, right? That kind of talk about the differences between the contracts and grants. So overall, just a quick recap, right? The purpose of a grant, more assistance in mind. And then for those research contracts, it's more about acquisition, right? We want to acquire specific services for a specific purpose. The control is different. So for grants, you have a little bit more leeway, right? It's a little bit more broader, and the principal investigator has that control or more control over the scope of a project. Whereas for research grants, it's the opposite. The funder has that control. It's more flexible for a grant when we're talking about a scope. I mean, it's a little bit less flexible, of course, when we're talking about a contract. However, it's very important, right? When we talk about compliance, the compliance burden is high for both. It's different focuses for either, but the compliance burden, in my opinion, and in my mind, it's high for all. We got to make sure that we're abreast of all those federal guidelines, state guidelines, institutional policies and procedures, and the whole gamut. And we'll talk about some of those in a little bit more detail. Okay. All right, so moving along to core compliance framework. All right, so these are just some things to just be mindful of when we approach compliance. Okay. And again, I know that many on the call maybe have already seen all of this, have been through something similar to this, but a refresher is always good, right? So, number one, I would just say for anyone, if you haven't already, you need to be familiar with the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR 200. And you can go online, they have it electronically. I have a little pocket guide somewhere around here in my office. It has all the answers to everything definitely when it comes to when it comes to cost principles, spending, things of that nature, right? It covers the whole gamut: indirect costs, travel, unallowable, allowable costs. A lot of the conversations and a lot of the questions that we spend when we call the FAQ line for grants.gov, a lot of those answers are already there. So if you haven't already, I would just recommend you get familiar with it. It's not a fun read, but it's a necessary read. So I definitely add that to my toolkit. Um, and of course, when we're talking about compliance, and even the proposal process, getting familiar with an RFP or with your contract, RFQ, RFA, however it's given out to you, getting familiar with that so that you're up to date with whatever the specific regulations would be, any stipulations, guidelines. Just make sure that you're very familiar with those. For those who work at institutions that are on the call, it's extremely important to make sure that you are aware and abreast of all institutional policies and procedures. Okay. This comes into play, of course, like for audits, um, um, and of course, overall efficiency of the institution, right? Everybody needs to kind of know what everybody is doing so that the institution can run smoothly. And I know that's above, probably my pay grade, what we're talking about right now, but it's just something to keep in mind as you move forward. And then, of course, as always, right, make sure that you're working ethically. Make sure that you're with your research and how you conduct research, you do it in a responsible manner, keeping IRB, things of that nature. Just make sure that you're keeping those, being aware of those things. Okay. All right. So pre-award. All right. So before you receive any funding, um, the funding opportunity review is extremely important. Honestly, it helps it helps so that you don't waste any time, right? So going through and looking through an opportunity that comes to your desk, every opportunity may not be the one for you or your organization or institution, right? And so it's extremely important to make sure that when you're reviewing these opportunities, that you ensure that they're in alignment with capacity, um, and what the institution or your organization can offer, right? Also, just looking through, make sure that you're eligible. Look at those eligibility requirements. And then, you can spot check compliance checks, right? Do you have things in place to ensure that you can fulfill the deliverables requested timely and efficiently, right? And so, that does take, a little bit of monitoring, on a quarterly basis, yearly, just some type of monitoring metric needs to be in place. Okay. The part that I love or enjoy the most is definitely that budget development and kind of scaling out what your project will look like, and then what those dollars look like towards, your impact and impending, or your perceived impact, right? Where do those dollars match up in that? And then finally, and I know we touched on it previously, but just those internal approvals and submission. So, I spent time working at Tougaloo College, 4-year private institution, smaller institution. And one of the things that is extremely important, and I'm sure that many others may deal with this, especially if we're talking about research faculty and research funding, is the so release time, right? I just started to shudder just saying that, but release time is definitely pivotal, right? Because when faculty are researching and working on these projects, right? These projects come in, they have indirect dollars, time has to be put on the project, and so that takes away time from the faculty to teach courses. And so, accreditation comes into that. Then you have to collaborate with the academic affairs office, and it's just a lot of players in that whole process. And so it's just important to make sure that whatever policies and procedures are in place for your grants submission process, it just needs to make sure that is followed. And I would also say, if there are any issues with the process, to make sure that you discuss, how things can be made, a little bit better or more efficient for the institution as a whole. Because it's a living and breathing. Well, no, it's art and science, right? So, I just think it's really important to make sure that you continue to evaluate that process and follow it, and just to make sure that it works the best for all parties involved. Okay. So post award. All right. Award acceptance and setup. So once you received an award, you receive the grant award notification letter, or your sub award, or your contract, uh, signed contract comes in, executed. Award acceptance, and then the setup portion is extremely important. So you need to be aware of your institution or organization's policy and procedure around that, right? Usually, I can't say usually, from my experience, the grants office kind of helps with the management of it on the post award side, but the finance office, they ultimately handle all of the account setup. And I know other institutions may have it, there are different ways that it can be done. Um, but just being aware of what that process looks like and who those key players are. Allowable cost management. We'll talk about this in just a moment, a little bit more. But if you ever have pause, or you have any doubts about an expenditure that you want to send in, pick up the phone and call someone. Of course, I would say your grants office, compliance office, but if, depending on how your institution is set up, and then of course, if you have that direct line to your program officer, I asking those questions are always heeded. Okay. Effort reporting is extremely important. This is where you can see a lot of compliance hiccups, right? How do you keep up with and document time on these projects? So back to the release time example that we talked about just a minute ago. There are a lot of faculty, especially during the summertime, but throughout the year, that may be on multiple projects. And so we need to make sure that we effectively and completely document how much time is set towards each of these projects, right? Can't go over 100%. You can only work 100%. I know one time they kind of were very lenient on that line. I think it was, maybe could get away with a little bit more, but I know now it's 100%, cannot go over 100% of effort. So regardless of how many projects that you're working on, 100% is the number, and that what needs to be on your time and effort form. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Technical and financial reporting. It'll say it in your grant award notification. You will know exactly about your performance reports, when they're due, if they're quarterly, biannually, annually, your finance reports, the frequency, the cadence that you need to send them in and turn them in. It's extremely important that not only are they accurate, but that they are received timely. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, but those are just some of the post-award responsibilities. There are other things on the post-award side that need to be done. We'll touch on some of those throughout the presentation. Okay, so allowable cost principles. I think that it's extremely, extremely, extremely important to make sure that you're familiar, right? So we always talk about allowability, right? Is this an allowable cost? Can we spend these dollars on that? There are going to be some stipulations. There are going to be some specific guidelines in these RFPs, RFQs, and these contracts that you'll see things that you cannot spend. But then there are a host of things that are already listed in that CFR 200 for the uniform guidance that are unallowable costs. But there are some things that are not listed that you just need to be mindful of, right? So necessary, reasonable, allocable. I have this is like seared in my brain. um, every cost has to be all three. It has to be necessary, it has to be reasonable, and it has to be allocable. Cannot be one or two, it has to be all three. If it does not meet that determination, then it is not an allowable cost. So is it necessary for the project? Reasonableness. Do you have quotes? Is this the going rate for this expenditure, right? Are you spending $10,000 on a pen? I don't think that's a reasonable expense, right? And then allocable, is this something that is in an approved budget? So these are just things that you just definitely need to be mindful of as you move through the process of your granting cycle or your contract. Direct versus indirect cost rules. Those direct costs, those are those that are directly affecting the project. Indirect costs, there's a lot to talk about, a lot to be discussed here, right? Uh, I think most institutions here on the call have a negotiated rate with the federal government. Um, and with that negotiated rate, you cannot go over that rate on any project that you have. Some projects are going to have a cap, right? They may state grant projects or yeah, probably those grant projects that have a cap, no more than 8%, 10%, something like that. There's also that de minimis rate. If you don't have a negotiated rate, then 10% is kind of the de minimis rate if you see that listed there. You can't go over. However, depending on your policies and procedures at your institution, I don't know there could be some approvals that are needed where the full rate doesn't have to be charged to the project. So why is this important, right? There are some institutions that may have a negotiated rate of 40, 48%, 50%, right? And if you get $100,000 in the full budget, the budget ceiling is $100,000. 52% of that has to go to, or 40% of that has to go to the indirect cost. Then that only leaves you with 60,000 for your project. Well, what if your project cost that you have is a little more than that, 75? So you may have to go through some channels, whatever policies and procedures there to get approval to go below that rate. Um, and some certain instances that may happen, maybe not. I know that different setups are at different institutions, right? Because indirect cost is used in various ways. It funds various things. So again, prior approval is going to be required. Just make sure that you're aware of that. I do want to take this time just to mention about extension requests. So, of course, I know for grants, you have an option for no cost extensions at times. I would just say, and this is just a recommendation, just for you to take with you, but that should not be an option. You should not even think about that as an option, right? Especially for contracts, you have those strict timelines and deliverables and when they need to be met. And if they're not met, you really are held outside of compliance. So I would just err on the side of completing your grant programs and projects and adhere to the timeline. Okay. And essentially the documentation standards. So just make sure that you're aware. I know for federal grants, after the grant is completed, you have to keep them for 7 years. Um, and in some instances, there could be some instances where a project may ask for things to be kept a little bit longer. But as a rule, or policies and procedures that may state, how long things need to be kept. I just would say that make sure that you are aware specifically on this, because if you keep it longer, and if an auditor comes in and if they see that document, then they can audit those documents. So, I mean, it's just something just to be mindful of. If you've kept it for the required amount of time and it's no longer needed, then dispose of it appropriately. And just keep that on the forefront. Okay. All right. Time and effort reporting. Okay. So I know release time is just something that when I think about faculty, I just remember that was one of the things that we talked about quite a bit at Tulu. So, make sure that the salary that's charged on a grant or a research project, make sure that it's reflected on your time and effort form, and reconcile and ensure that it adds up. Um, and I know that's probably going to take some collaboration with multiple departments, right? Your finance office and your grants office, and even yours if you're reconciling with your own records. It's just extremely important to ensure that time and effort is accurate. Okay. All right. Certification requirements. Please make sure that any staff has the correct certifications that they need to have on file and that is readily available if asked. Um, the next one for cost share tracking and matches. So you'll see them on the RFP, what those requirements are. Please ensure that if a match has been entered, whatever the ratio, just ensure that it is tracked accordingly, right? It doesn't need to be tracked in multiple places, okay? So just ensure that you're up to date and aware of where the matches are have been indicated that they've come from, okay? And then audit risk. Okay, so risk assessments, I think that they're uh, essential. If they're done annually, and then those capacity reviews. Just look at, what your institution can provide. What staff do we have on place? What equipment do we have? What are some gaps? Where are some things where we may be a little bit vulnerable? I think it's important to be aware of these things as we're looking at opportunities, as we're looking to partner with some of these funders, because ultimately the best way to build a relationship with a funder, contracts, grants, federal government organizations, is to complete projects timely and accurately, and have that impact as implicated in your application. Okay. And so the best way to do this is more, I guess, proactive, right? Just to do your risk assessments, your capacity review, so that you put yourself in the best position to complete these projects timely, efficiently, and ultimately build those relationships. Okay. All right. Subawards and partnerships. So um I would just say on some of these awards, you would be the prime, right? You'd be the first line that gets the funding, but then it can, kind of go down, right? You can offer sub awards, employ contractors, and then things can go further downstream. Just be aware of that, mindful of that, where you are on that line, on that totem pole. There are going to be different documents and agreements that need to be signed and followed and adhered to, and things of that nature. I will say here, if you have a subaward or anything further downstream with a prime, this is a perfect opportunity to build a relationship or continue to build on a relationship with a potential partner. Because if this is your first time working with someone or an institution, and you do great, right? You turn in all your reports on time, all of your performance reports, you're meeting or exceeding the deliverables that were asked for, right? When additional funds come in, in that capacity or others that you've implicated that the institution is, could work well in. I mean, that would build that relationship even further and for longer. So it's just really important just to be on top of that. I could risk assessment you guys to death, but also performance and financial oversight. So, rule of thumb on the financial oversight, monthly, you probably need to be looking at your budgets, right? Making sure that what you have, because you need to keep up with your budget, on your own, and you need to reconcile with either your grants office or your finance office. That's just a rule of thumb. I would say on a monthly basis, just kind of check in, see where they are, see where you are. And then that's also an opportunity to kind of ask some of those additional questions like, hey, are these allowable costs? This is also a great time. I want to mention the burn rate. So when you have a grant, the burn rate, or when you have a contract, your burn rate is how fast you spend the money, right? So I think about it in quarterly increments, right? So in 4 increments, right? So at least this is just rule of thumb what I'm saying. At least in the first quarter, 25%, right, of those funds need to be spent, right? Then the next quarter, at least another 25. At the end of the grant period, there doesn't need to be any funding left over. So, that's kind of a rule of thumb. What you don't want to happen is in your fourth quarter or the last quarter of a grant cycle or a contract cycle, and you have 75% of the money still sitting there. So, you spent, more than, 3/4 of the time with this grant just planning, maybe, I don't know, but no expenditures were sent. And so that kind of sends up a red flag. So be very mindful and cognizant of the burn rate as you go through the grant cycle. So that also means, when we talk about burn rate, that means invoices. So invoices need to be sent. They need to be sent on time. They need to be sent timely. Sometimes really in those contracts, they're going to say, hey, we need an invoice monthly, or we need an invoice quarterly, or we need it on the 5th of every month. Just make sure that those are being followed by the T. Because again, that's a compliance issue if you don't. And if you're out of compliance, they can they can ask for the money back. You don't want that to happen. So it's just something else to be mindful of. All right. So just some common compliance risk, unallowable costs. Just ensure that your costs are allowable, right? Talking about necessary, reasonable, and allocable. Late and inaccurate reporting. Make sure that all your reports are completed on time, timely. As stated in your contract, your agreement, your award notification, just make sure that you follow it to the T. Any scope changes. So we're talking about if anything changes in the scope of work, or if you're making changes to the budget, line item changes, those need to be approved. You need to be working on an approved budget. Okay. I know it's different schools of thought on this, but I'm just saying from my standpoint and from my vantage point, I always want to be operating on an approved budget. Why? Why is that, Kerry? Well, because at any time the funder, can request records. They can do a desk review. They can ask to see anything. And if they come in and you're not operating on a budget that was approved, that's compliance risk. Those funds can be recouped. Those funds can be requested back. Okay. So just make sure that you are. And I know, when you're talking about line items and things happening in place, I get it. Just don't let those things linger. Okay. I guess that's the best way to say it. And then also inadequate documentation. Just want to make sure that the documents that you do send in, they are accurate. Just make sure that you give them what they want, what they ask for, what was approved, or what was in that grant award agreement. Just make sure that that's what's sent. Okay. All right. A few quick tips for faculty. All right. So I would just say make sure that you engage your research office early in the process. Of course, if you come to a new institution, I would just say in that first week when you're making all your meetings and meeting everybody, just make sure that research office, compliance office, academic affairs, just make sure that they're on that meeting docket so that you can kind of get a lay of the land. I'd also say if you get wind of a opportunity for a grant opportunity or research opportunity that you want to work on, the earliest, the better for you to kind of go ahead and start talking with the research office about, steps to get things going. I would say for you to keep project documentation. So you need to keep your own documentation when you, particularly when we're talking about finance. So when we're talking about your budgets and things of that nature. But the research office, one of the duties and responsibilities is to be sort of like a clearinghouse, right? For all grants, all things grants. So, you should be able to go to your research office and have a copy of your indirect cost rate agreement. You should have, background on the institution. They should have a kind of a storage or database, a knowledge base of some of those common documents that are requested on grant funding, right? And so, they should be your top resource, to kind of get some of that stuff. Okay. Again, I think I talked about it. You can't talk about budgets enough, but just make sure that you're tracking your time and effort, right, for salaries and things of that nature, but also just spending in general. Just track it. I would track it and reconcile on a monthly basis. Okay. And then, whoever you need to collaborate with at your institution, just make sure that those parties are aware and they're engaged. Okay. And then, of course, please, please, please make sure that you get approval for any budget changes or any scope changes. It's just very, very important. Don't want to get caught and not operating as described in the proposal that was sent. Okay. All right. So really quickly, where do we find some opportunities? Um, so here, these are just these are kind of for federal grants and federal contracts. Grants.gov, sam.gov. I mean, this is your bread and butter. This is where everything is listed, right? Um, so I don't know if you've seen it recently, but grants.gov looks very different now. The way you search into it, they made it more user friendly, in my opinion. But that's definitely your bread and butter to find what you're looking for. I even saw in there that you can also search by if they're asking for cost share, match, things of that nature. So I would definitely make sure recommend that you're there on grants.gov to look for opportunities. Um, sam.gov, they have contracting opportunities that are listed on that site for both. So for grants.gov, you need to have your own login. So you have to go on login.gov and you need to set up your account if you don't already. And that may be a part of your onboarding at your institution. But the reason why is because they also have like a what do you call it? It's a shared site, right? Where everybody's working on a team of people can work on a grant project together in that document together, in grants.gov together. So you need to have your own login to make sure that you can do that. Your grants office, as I stated earlier, is like your clearinghouse, right? So they should have the rights to actually, push the submission button, but you should be able to be in there uploading documents, and working with other folks and kind of seeing the status of the submission. SAMS.gov, they just have them listed there. They're not as they have some opportunities listed there, but grants.gov is probably your bread and butter. And then also, of course, those federal agency websites, go to NSF website, NIH's website. They have opportunities there listed quite frequently. Some of them are cyclical in nature. So even if you may have missed the deadline this year, it's going to come back around next year. Some that I can name off top would be for students. I know NSF, they have the Robert Noyce teacher scholarship program. I know they have the STEM program. These are with NSF. It's quite a few there where you can offer, students working in STEM, they can get scholarships, they can get stipends, supplements, things like that. So I would definitely recommend you just looking at those websites and kind of seeing some opportunities there. Okay. And again, some of this stuff, I'm pretty sure that the grants office has all of this stuff there, but just a quick checklist. Just need to make sure that the EIN number of the institution is held. We need to have that for all of those applications. SAM.gov registration, login.gov registration, the UEI number. So once you do SAM.gov, you get your UEI number, and then that grants.gov registration. And I'm going to speed through this a little bit. So that previously that was pretty much the kind of the process, kind of talking more about the overview, grants, research contracts, just a lot of information, right? So I just wanted to end, and this is going to kind of, 'cause I'm looking at time, so just kind of want to go through just some tips, nothing too deep, just about proposal development. I'm pretty sure that many of you already have this down to a T, but these are just some things just to be mindful of. All right. So when you're writing the proposal, when you're starting to write it, right? But before you in engage, right? These are some things that you should already kind of have in mind, especially when we're talking about research grants, right? So you should already have your concept together. You should have your program description, and then maybe a brief or like a brief, concise outline of what your budget could look like, right? At any time, because a lot of times you can shop around some of these ideas in some instances to other funding opportunities, right? So after you do that, after you see a grant opportunity, you'll make a decision right there, right? And it goes into play when you're talking about eligibility. Are we eligible? Do we have capacity? You're gonna make that go or no go decision, right? Are you gonna take it? Are you gonna go for it, try to write for it, or not? Okay. Then once you decide, we're going to go straight into developing the proposal. And so this is not a one shop fits all, but these are general categories that you're going to have for your grant application. So just start thinking about that executive summary, your statement of need, um, those goals and objectives. Make sure that those are smart goals and objectives. Your staff, you're gonna need your data management plan, evaluation, and in some instances they do ask for a sustainability plan, right? So after the funding is gone, how will this continue? And just depends on what project we're talking about. All right, just some key points about the budget. You cannot go over the limit, okay? I think that goes without saying, but please don't go over the limit that they've subscribed or described in the funding application. Um, just make sure that you have a realistic budget. Also, for some of those multi-year grants, I think you should make it scalable. That first year is what implementation year. So probably more of the funding should probably be in the implementation year where you buy in, the computers and equipment and things of that nature. But then in year two, you're not gonna be buying those same projects, right? So just make sure that it kind of scales down for some of those multi-year grants. Just something to think about. And then just make sure you identify all your costs, right? And this is while you're building your budget. What are some of those anticipated costs? Is a match required? And then indirect costs, right? How much, is this going to impact my budget? And then make sure you arrange your budget items accordingly. Okay. And then finally, so a lot of times they're going to ask for some organizational information, and I know in that statement of need, it's kind of where some of that may go as well, right? Like, what's the area that you are working with, and the institutional past performance and things of that nature. So just make sure you kind of have some of that language readily available. And then of course at the end, you're just going to make sure you conclude, just summarize all your main points there. Good. Supporting documentation, this just goes without saying, just some things that you need to make sure that you have. I would pay attention to this last bullet more than anything. Just make sure that any documentation that they ask for, that it is included in your application. Okay, any documentation they ask for is included in your application. Um, these applications, they need to be filled out completely. Everything that they ask for needs to be there. Okay. If not, there could be it could be anything missing, and that's a reason not to review this application. Okay. So, I mean, I put a lot of words here, but at the end of the day, you got to follow those guidelines exactly as written. Make sure that you're familiar with that RFP. Begin early. If you have questions, don't wait until, an hour before submission to ask the question. Join those calls. Usually a lot of times for some of these bigger projects, they'll have like a workshop where they kind of have those Q&A. They kind of go over some things, talk about some past um, uh, awardees, things like that. Just make sure that you're engaged and ask those questions. Don't be afraid to ask those questions if you have them. They'll answer you. They'll talk with you if you catch them. And so submission is just important. Just make sure that you're mindful, right? So in my experience, the sponsor programs office is the clearinghouse for those grants. But your institution may have different policies and procedures. You just need to make sure that you act accordingly there in that vein. It's not a lot of submissions that are going to be in person. I've had some statewide here in Mississippi that are they want an in-person delivery. But of course a lot of are mail, but for the most part you're working through a portal for these federal awards. So you're working through their submission portal or you're going through grants.gov, who is that mediary. I will say this, just a little tip for grants.gov. I don't know if I should, okay, yeah. So if you ever have an issue, because sometimes like everybody is against the gun and submitting at the last minute. So sometimes the server can get a little clogged up, right? And computer can start moving a little bit slow. If that ever happens to you on grants.gov only, you have to call and you have to get that number. You get your I think it's a customer service number. Get that number. You never know, but it could save your proposal. I'm not telling you what I've heard. I'm telling you what I know. And then, of course, post award, right? Just make sure that you are on top of your post award functions, right? Your reporting, make sure you're drawing down your funds, timely invoicing when you should. Closeout. So typically, closeout is 90 days. Typically, is 90 days after the project ends, where you had that final reports in, and all that good stuff. But make sure that all your funds are spent prior to the end of the grant. You don't have 90 days to spend the money. The money has to be spent at the end of the grant period. So just make sure that you're aware of that. And so finally, for just the last couple of takeaways, I know we talked about, how those grants or research grants, how they differ from those research contracts. So as you're looking and searching and identifying those that kind of align with your institution or your research interests, just make sure to keep those in mind. Also, just compliance is everybody's business, right? The institution definitely wins when faculty win these awards, right? So we just need to make sure that we continue to build relationships by making sure we have a culture of compliance, right? So just keep that in mind. It goes without saying the faculty's role in this process is extremely critical. And I remember working with folks down at Tougaloo and just some of the great work that they were doing. I was amazed by some of these projects from our subject matter experts that we were looking at, and it was amazing. So you all are extremely critical to that process. And then, strong systems, right? When I was talking about the sponsor programs office is extremely important. If you don't have one, and I'm sure everybody here on the call does, but if you don't, I'm sure the TCRDF can give you some insight on how you can effectively structure your grants process at your institution so that you can get those awards in I don't want to say easier, but so that you can get them with less stress, I guess I can say that. So yeah. But anyway, I think that's my last slide. Thank you all so much for joining the call, and I guess we'll open it up now for questions or discussion, John.
Thank you, Kerry. One of the things you just mentioned, I would appreciate if you would kind of follow up on it a little bit. You mentioned relationships. Tell us a little bit about relationships with the program managers in the federal agencies.
Oh, definitely, definitely. So I think that the relationships with the program officers are critical. So one of the things when I as a young grantee, it's a little bit intimidating initially talking with folks, but what I realized is we're all uh everybody is trying to figure some of this stuff out. Everybody's not an expert. I'll say it like that. I think it's extremely important to make sure that you're on the phone. Um, Anytime that there's some issues that arise, just pick up the phone and kind of talk through some of those things. But the best way to build a relationship with a funder or a sponsor or anything like that is to adhere to the guidelines, right? That timely submission, that those timely reports that are sent, I mean, it does wonders. And when they're talking about everybody that they gave funds to, because they have those evaluative sessions, right? And they could say, "Oh man, you remember that when we were working with Tougaloo? Oh man, they did an amazing job. They sent everything on time. I hope that they submit again, so you want to be in that part of the conversation, right? But I think that those things are extremely critical.
Speaking of that, with relationships, what type of relationships have you seen with R1s, and how critical can they be for a small school? Let's like say like Tougaloo.
Oh man, they would be extremely, extremely critical. So, when we talk about those R1s who routinely receive some funding from the federal government, you know, some of the opportunities for some of those smaller institutions to offer their resources and capacity with some of those R1s will be crucial, right? Giving them the opportunity to provide the capacity that they do have. Um, I just think it would be awesome. And then, giving them that opportunity. And then once that opportunity is given and is blown out of the water, I mean, it's continual relationship building, right? So
Hmm.
I just think that that would be extremely important.
So how do we get the smaller schools to partner with the larger schools, and what's the value of the relationships that the larger schools already have with the agencies that the smaller schools don't have?
That is a great question. I mean, I think that we gotta, number one, we gotta get in the room. We have to get in rooms together, right? We have to talk, right? Those conferences, um, um, I think that those offer opportunities to build relationships. I also think that we need to have, and we probably already do, but there definitely needs to be some groundwork done regarding capacity, right? What can we offer? So I think that we need to have that work done, those risk assessments, that capacity review. It's extremely important for us to have our work done on the front end so that when we're in these rooms, we're not just asking for opportunity, we're telling you what opportunities that we need and that we want. Um, I think that it also helps our students, right? And these are all students. These are students nationwide, right? When our students are involved in some of these projects, or their instructors are involved in some of these projects, a lot of times those TAs are brought in to kind of help in a little bit. So I just think the full gamut. I think those relationships are extremely important for all parties involved.
So, Carrie, thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation, and to all the schools on the line. It's excuse me. Just want to let you know that TCRDF is here to work with you. If you are interested with the Shared Services Center, learning more about it, you may visit our website, tcrdf.org. We do have relationships with a number of R1s. I'm happy to see some of them on the call today. And they are eager. They've worked with us to form partnerships with other HBCUs, and they're eager and available to work with you to form those partnerships. As Carrie mentioned, one of the largest advantages is they have the relationships in those agencies that we don't have. And those relationships are so valuable that just so valuable. That's all I can say. They can open doors that we can't open. They can open doors that we don't even know exist, and get us in there before the program managers, and we can leverage the R1's relationship with the program managers. And the R1s are interested in working with us because they find additional talent that they don't necessarily have at their own spaces, and they can develop the relationships with our students for future opportunities at their institutions. So it's a win-win opportunity for everybody, and we certainly appreciate you being here. Yeah. Oh, Tom, go right ahead, sir.
Hey, yeah, sorry, I was listening. I was a little late to the meeting, and sorry about that, Dr. McCarty. But I just wanted to build on some great answers that Carrie Thomas had mentioned. Coming from Georgia Tech, we are definitely uh, interested in partnering with other schools, and to build on that, it helps us to understand what key or unique capabilities those other schools bring to the table that can be complementary and build a stronger team. So we are always interested in um, collaboration going forward. So I just wanted to throw that out for everyone on the call. Thank you.
Well, Tom, we really appreciate that. And I would say that TCRDF has been working with Georgia Tech now for
Oh,
pre-pandemic. That's the only way I know to define it, pre-pandemic. It's been
yes.
a great relationship, and we really appreciate that and look forward to exposing and working with other areas at Georgia Tech with other HBCUs that are interested.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.